listeners. You are listening to the Natives Razabat podcast. I'm your host, Michael, and today we have our special Banjo Paterson Day podcast, in which we will also talk a bit about some of the events of Australia Month, sometimes called January. Joining me today, we have Trent. How you going, mate?
Yeah, I'm really well, thanks. How are you, Michael?
Yeah, not too bad. It's been pretty warm down here in sunny Melbourne. Just going along, really. Busy at work.
Nice.
Yeah, okay. So before we get into the meat of the podcast, we did miss a few comments from a couple of podcasts ago since we skipped this section last podcast, which is the lifestyle advice one. So this is a catch-up on some comments made on the Entryism podcast we did back with John Lawson. So we did get an interesting comment here from Connell 7030, who said, what is the ANA's position on local Australian culture? Would the cultivation of local peculiarities like Barossa German be considered un-Australian? Well, I don't think the ANA has an official policy on this. There's a fair bit of leeway to believe what you like within the broad tent of nativism. But personally, for me, I think cultivation of local peculiarities is definitely a good thing, and very much in the spirit of nationalism, which is and also traditionalism as well, I would say, which is always kind of a bit more about the organic and the local and what kind of naturally rises out of a particular place and a particular people, as opposed to, you know, this universalizing, homogenizing mission of globo homo. So in my opinion, yeah, like cultivation of Barossa German within like an Australian culture, so it's sort of like a nativized Germanic culture there is a good thing. What do you reckon, Trent?
Yeah, agree with everything that you just said. I did look up the Barossa Germans, and they predate the Federation of Australia. They arrived in the mid 1800s, so it's not like they're a really foreign import or implant. They're kind of something that's happened naturally. And further to that, I'd say staying in touch with your roots and your ancestors is always a good thing. And if people want to do that through, you know, the food that they eat or the cuisine, you know, the clothes that they wear. If you want to wear a kilt to a wedding, you can still be an Australian. I think that's my answer for that.
Yeah, and I mean, it's any sort of cuisine that you bring as well is going to sort of adapt to some extent as well. So, you know, growing wine is not necessarily inherently Australian or whatever, right? It's a global thing, but then each region becomes sort of famous for its own vintages and all that. And obviously the Barossa Valley and the Yarra Valley and all these areas in Australia are very well known for their wines and all that sort of thing. So, yeah, I think that's it's perfectly in line with our European ancestry.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, next comment. So regular commenter, Scare West, thank you, Scare West, says, if you are not getting involved either by party politics, organisations that run third-party campaigns, becoming a businessman who can donate to supportive campaigns, or even just doing things locally in local community groups, environmental groups, ratepayers, sporting groups, etc., and government, then nothing will change. Which is fine, but then don't complain when things get bad. Evil wins when good people do nothing. Trent, you would like to say something about this?
Yeah, I agree with the sentiment. Just on a personal note, I don't see myself getting involved in any political parties or doing any donating at least not in the immediate future. I don't think that's a good place for me to spend my time and energy. But in all other community things, I really agree with this. And encourage people to take on that attitude.
Yeah, look, I pretty much agree with the party stuff. While there isn't really a party that is worth throwing support behind, we probably shouldn't be doing that unless you're really keen to get the experience in electoral politics, in which case you're not necessarily doing it for the benefit of the movement, but more for your own, I guess, private career or whatever you may be interested in doing there. But what I kind of like about this comment is the variety of things that he suggests. So, you know, I think there are a lot of people out there for whom it's, you know, my way or the highway. And I don't think that's the case at all. I think the movement needs to be spread across all these different areas. Like business is something that's just not discussed enough, I think, in nationalism. Like we're all very focused on, what's overtly political, but like everything is political fundamentally if we're going to go with the kind of situation created by the postmodern left with these slogans like the personal is political and all these things. So yeah, look, business, very important. We know we live in a kind of oligarchic system, and we need to combat that, and that could be through entryism in the business world. So yeah, for sure. Love the comment. Okay, so that's it for the comments. Okay, we're moving on to the poetry segment, which is basically the whole show today. We'll talk about a few other things, and it won't be all just reading poetry. But given that we're on the Banjo Paterson Day podcast, poetry is going to have to be front and center. And we'll start with, I think, a poem about Federation Day, since the other theme is Australia Month, and Australia Month starts with Federation Day, the 1st of January, 1901. And so here is Paterson's Song of the Federation. As the nations sat together, grimly waiting, the fierce and ancient nations battle-scarred, grown grey in their lusting and their hating, ever armed and ever ready keeping guard, through the tumult of their warlike preparation and the half-stilled clamour of the drums came a voice crying, "Lo, a new-made nation, to her place in the sisterhood she comes." And she came. She was beautiful as morning, with the bloom of the roses on her mouth, like a young queen lavishly adorning her claims with the splendours of the south. And the fierce old nations, looking on her, said, "Nay, surely she were quickly overthrown. Hath she strength for the burden laid upon her? Hath she power to protect and guard her own?" Then she spoke, and her voice was clear and ringing in the ears of the nations old and grey, saying, "Hark, and ye shall hear my children singing their war song in countries far away. They are strangers to the tumult of the battle. They are few, but their hearts are very strong. 'Twas but yesterday they called unto the cattle, but they now sing Australia's marching song. For the honour of Australia, our mother, side by side with our kin from over the sea, we have fought and we have tested one another, and enrolled among the brotherhood are we. There was never post of danger but we sought it, in the fighting through the fire and through the flood. There was never prize so costly but we bought it, though we paid for its purchase with our blood. Was there any road too rough for us to travel? Was there any path too far for us to tread? You can track us by the blood drops on the gravel, on the roads that we milestoned with our dead. And for you, our young and anxious mother, oh, your great gains keeping watch and ward, neither fearing nor despising any other, we will hold your possessions with the sword." Then they passed to the place of world-long sleeping, to grey-clad figures with their dead, to the sound of their women softly weeping, and the dead march moaning at their head. And the nations, as the grim procession ended, whispered, "Child, thou hast seen the price we pay. From war may we ever be defended. Kneel thee down, new-made sister, let us pray." Okay, that was Song of the Federation by Banjo Paterson. What did you think, Trent?
I thought it was kind of bleak. It's not really the sort of optimistic, we've just been federated, it's like the dawning of a new Australian age poem that I was sort of expecting when I started reading that. Just the descriptions of the old European countries as battle scarred and grey, and it's even like almost a bit skeptical or concerned about the future of Australia, saying surely she were quickly overthrown had she the strength for the burden laid upon her, which is it's interesting that at that time that was the train of thought that was on.
Yeah, I mean, and you're thinking in terms of literature, you've got all the way through Australian literature, really, you have this theme of invasion literature, and it goes back to Europe as well. But really, in Australia, it's focused around the threat from Asia, the Yellow Peril, right? You've got these kind of explicit kind of race war books being written by people like William Lane, famously of the New Australia colony in Paraguay. And that was really something, I think, that was very much in the minds, because obviously one of the key motivations for federation was to stop unchecked immigration into the different colonies. Because, one colony like Victoria or New South Wales would put a poll tax on immigrants from China, so that they would have to pay a large fee to enter the colony if they're getting off the boat, right? But the Chinese, especially in the time of the gold rush, right, where they're trying to get to the different gold fields, they'd land in places which didn't have this poll tax, like famously Northern Australia, which was seen as, sort of this empty gateway into the continent. But it could also be South Australia and walking over through the Victorian border. So it was very important to a lot of the colonies that they could federate and have a one policy to protect the border and prevent this issue, and to also remigrate a lot of the people that were already there. So it's very kind of topical to modern Australia. And if you think about Australian literature, this theme of invasion literature carries all the way through. Quite a popular children's novel. I don't know if you've read it. It was made into a movie as well, but it was a series of novels. Tomorrow When the War Began by John Marsden. You familiar with that one?
Yeah, I read that one as a young teen.
Yeah, right. And it's even been set as a school text, I think, and on all sorts of things. John Marsden's quite popular in Australian literature. Although, I mean, people are now looking at this text in the context of political correctness and, wanting to throw it out, of course, because the subtext there is, invasion, and it's clearly going to be from one of the surrounding nations, which are all Asiatic. So there is that implicit racial angle to the text that makes a lot of lefties very uncomfortable now. And even Marsden has sort of come out and, said, I'm not racist, but I kind of regret writing the text this way and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, like when we're talking about back to the poem, right, this idea that she's got this burden and this danger of being quickly overthrown. Like there was this fear and this idea that Australia needed to be ready to fight. And this again carries through the first, not just the last part of the 19th century, but the first part of the 20th century, because we go off to World War One. Well, this thesis well defended in the book, Best We Forget, rather. Best We Forget is the book that talks about how Australia really went to war in World War One to keep the British Empire together, to show our loyalty, so that the British Empire would be there to back us in the case of a Asian invasion. Right, the sort of rallying cry was, go off to France to keep Australia white. So, and then obviously we hit World War II, and it's just overtly Japanese invasion. So, like a very important theme and expected here. But it also, I think, shows like the theme, this poem of to be a nation, you sort of have to have struggled for your own survival. So those nations that still survive are those battle-scarred nations that have grown grey. But the other thing I really love about this poem is the emphasis on how Australia is a new nation born among the old, because we are very much a new nation compared to all these old European countries. And we're born into this old age of modernity and trying to survive as this new thing. So I think that's kind of interesting, because on one side we are just in the same situation as everyone else, but we don't have necessarily the same depth of tradition without going back to the old world. So there is sort of a bit more perhaps potential for something completely new to come about here. All this idea, she was beautiful as morning, with the bloom of the roses on her mouth, like a young queen, lavishly adorning her claims of the splendors of the South. Very interesting. And obviously we get the battle song, which is like the latter half of this poem. It's kind of two poems rolled into one, which is very much contributing to that image of the Australian soldier that gets rolled into the Anzac myth and is really one of those pillars of our identity. To sort of prefigure we're going to read a nice little article written by Elias Priestley a little later on, but to prefigure that, this is also kind of a bit of an imperial poem, because Banjo very much admired Kipling and met him during the Boer Wars. And so we have the, side by side with our kin from over the sea, we have fought and we have tested one another, and enrolled among the brotherhood are we. So perhaps the brotherhood is the brotherhood of nations, but it could also be read, I suppose, as the brotherhood of the British Empire, and that kinship of sort of British race patriotism. Anything else that you'd like to talk about with this one?
No, I enjoyed this, and it's a really good insight into, I think, probably a common mindset at the time of Federation.
Yeah.
So that was what I got out of it.
Yeah. And just to talk a little bit more about Australia Month, I'm not sure what you boys did, but the Victorian branch of the ANA went to pay their respects at Deacon's. And that was something we did because Deacon was a president of the ANA down here and very involved in the ANA, not just in the ANA, but also in other sort of patriotic associations like the Imperial Federation League. And with that, formative period where he was second prime minister, that was very much the time when this pattern of Australian politics, the Australia settlement, was being established. So, are you much familiar with the Australia settlement?
Only in passing.
Yeah, so just for the listeners, it's those 5 basically policies that made the mainstream Australian policy platform, which was defence of a white Australia, defence of industrial arbitration, which is very much out of the labor movement. We had protectionist policies, so your tariffs and all that. Imperial paternalism, so this idea that we need to be within the British Empire, and also the state paternalist aspect, which has evolved, I suppose, into the nanny state stuff that we despise now. But back then it was much more about nation building. And we have to remember, as we'll see in one of the other poems that we're about to read, that Australia was still very much unexplored, even towards the end of the 19th century. So why don't we turn to that poem now, and we can read the Elias article after that? What do you reckon?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah, all right. So we have Where the Pelican Builds by Mary Hannay Foote, which is an 1881 poem. It's got a little introductory note, which says, "The unexplored parts of Australia are sometimes spoken of by the bushmen of Western Queensland as the home of the pelican, a bird whose nesting place, so far as the writer knows, is seldom, if ever, found." So this sort of idea of mystery, I suppose, with the pelican, it's this bird that sort of just appears out of this unexplored gap in the map. All right, so here we go. Where the Pelican Builds. The horses were ready, the rails were down, but the riders lingered still. One had a parting word to say, and one had his pipe to fill. Then they mounted, one with a granted prayer, and one with a grief unguessed. "We are going," they said as they rode away, "where the pelican builds her nest." They had told us of pastures wide and green, to be sought past the sunset's glow, of rifts in the ranges by opal lit, and gold neath the river's flow. And thirst and hunger were banished words when they spoke of that unknown west. No drought they dreamt of, no flood they feared, where the pelican builds her nest. The creek at the ford was but fetlock deep, when we watched them crossing there. The rains had replenished it thrice since then, and thrice has the rock lain bare. But the waters of hope have flowed and fled, and never from Blue Hill's breast come back, by the sun and the sands devoured, where the pelican builds her nest. Right, so that was Where the Pelican Builds by Mary Hannay Foote, which was an incredibly popular poem of its time, late 19th century, 1881. What did you think of that, Trent?
Well, so this was the first time I've heard that one. This was a late addition to the podcast. It just got snuck in before we started recording, and I really enjoyed that one. I can see why it was popular. So much more uplifting than the Song of Federation, and just sort of felt like a bit of an adventurous spirit. Like it was joyous.
Yeah, joyous until the last stanza.
Yeah.
Because obviously we do have the spirit of wanting to get out there and explore, and kind of like the Americans do with their Manifest Destiny thing, right? This idea of heading out. For us, it's out to the west or whatever. And, these ideas of these dreams of great pastures, wide and green, and rifts in the ranges by opal lit. A lot of alliteration in this poem, which kind of, I think, helps give it that energy as well. You said the uplifting kind of mood with it, with the no drought they dreamt, no flood they feared. Yeah. So but which line is a bit of foreshadowing, of course, because in the last stanza, these four riders, or perhaps the count is not exact, perhaps it's two, depending on how you read it, but they don't return, do they? But nonetheless, it's important that we have this kind of spirit of exploration, of heading into the future, even if some people are kind of lost along the way, sacrifice themselves for the glory of the nation to be built. Yeah, so I agree with you. It does feel less somber and a little less serious than the previous poem by the banjo.
Yeah.
All right. Well, would you like to take us away with the reading of the article?
Yeah, sure. Cultural Memory and the Australian Nationalist Calendar. January 2025 was an amazing month in Australian nationalism. From climbing mountains to protesting on the street, we have seen various nationalist groups engage in a wide range of activities that have both celebrated and defended the Australian spirit. Key dates of the month, such as Federation Day and Australia Day, were celebrated, but we also cannot forget that state persecution continued, with the activists of the Australia Day 17 facing ridiculous charges from the police. Yes, we will remember and learn lessons from this month, but it is a broader theme of memory that needs to be discussed, which is the importance of cultural memory. Cultural memory, in contrast to your own private memories, is the memory that is shared by a group and is reinforced through collective ceremonies and embodiment in memorials, such as statues and shrines. Just as an individual, if he loses all his memory, loses much of his identity, a collective nation, if it does not reinforce and defend its culture and memory, loses itself and becomes easy prey for its enemies. When anti-Australian activists topple statues and protest on Australia Day, they are engaged in an all-out war on our national psyche. They seek to erase our memory of who we are. Given that our enemies are actively fighting on this front, it is vital for nationalists to both defend and take ground in the struggle over our cultural memory. With Australia Day having ended for the year, the nationalist movement should now look forward to the next events on the Australian calendar to guide our thinking, debates, and actions around cultural memory. Of course, we all already understand the importance of Anzac Day, and like Australia Day, it is a key event that the state has yet failed to extirpate. But I believe that it is important that in each month we have at least one day that we can focus on building our understanding of ourselves. Last year, the Natives Association held its first Banjo Paterson night on February 17th, the day of the great poet's birth. The idea behind Banjo Night is that nationalists should consciously seek to strengthen our awareness and appreciation of our national culture and literature by taking time to celebrate the man who is Australia's best-known poet and, alongside Henry Lawson, a key creator of the Australian identity. While we focused narrowly on Paterson's poetry last year, this year we will cast a wider net and look at Lawson and the Jindi Warrabak poets for their expressions of our unique character and visions of our future.
Yeah, do you want to stop here and discuss for a bit?
Yeah.
Yeah, so obviously with that last paragraph, we are indeed on the podcast looking at more poetry than just Paterson. So yeah, a bit of a coordinated push across the association on this one, which I think is a good idea, because while banjo is the most well known, we kind of want to be familiar with all of our culture and sort of encourage our fellow Australians to also, take the time to read it and all of that. And that's why I think Elias is kind of right about this idea of theming the months and all that, because it's, if you set aside a bit of time where you're like, okay, this is the time when I'm actually going to start reading a bit of this stuff and getting into it, it can kind of grow on you. Like I before I joined the association, I was never this interested or as familiar with Australian culture, but over time I've come to really appreciate just getting to know it and read it. And it's great getting into the literature, because reading both the history and the literature at the same time, you get so much more of a picture of how people felt back then, like we were talking about with the Federation poem and all that. But what are your takeaways here, Trent?
Yeah, the history and literature together thing is it just gives you such a more complete view. I think if people haven't read Sentimental Nation, they should give that a go, because it includes a lot of poetry, letters to the editor of newspapers, cartoons, like political cartoons and stuff, and it just gives you such a better picture and understanding of what was happening at the time. And as to what you were saying about setting aside a bit of time to explore this stuff, with Australia Month that just went by, I made a bit of a project for myself where every day I posted something Australian on social media, and over the course of the month, just thinking of an Australian author or a musical artist or a movie or something Australian that I liked, and sharing that with my friends. It gave me such a greater appreciation for Australia and being an Australian.
Yeah, totally agree. And with the Australia Month stuff, obviously the first paragraph of this ran through a few things. So people didn't quite catch those references. I mean, it was the Victorian branch, well, not all of the Victorian branch, but the more adventuresome and fit of the Victorian branch who did climb Mount Feathertop, which, we are working on everyone's fitness and getting those standards higher, but it's not exactly a rookie hike either. So that was definitely an interesting one. Protesting on the street, obviously, was not us in the ANA, because that's not really our style. But we did have a little reference thrown in there to the Australia Day 17 from the Adelaide protesting that we probably all saw on the news. And obviously, the state's come out with a lot of sort of repressive measures around that. We've got the new hate speech laws, or strengthening of the laws, to be totally broadened to ridiculous levels where, intent no longer matters and all this stuff, right? It's just if it's perceived that you kind of like recklessly said something that might offend someone, you're potentially getting into some strife. So definitely heading, unfortunately, the way of the UK with the policing, and it's definitely important that we all kind of have a strategy and are important with how we're approaching nationalism and the messaging that we're taking. All right, anything else, Trent, or should we keep going with the reading of it?
No, let's keep going. All right. We will also maintain the focus on Paterson by shining more of a light on a less well-appreciated aspect of his life and poetical aspirations, which is that he sought to be a poet of the British Empire. This is best seen in his work from the time of the Second Boer War, when he was a special war correspondent for the Sydney Morning Herald. It was at this time when he first met Rudyard Kipling in person. Although Kipling was already something of a model and inspiration for him in his own literary journey, indeed, the Barrier Minor newspaper of New South Wales depicted their meeting in the words, "The Australian Kipling has met the other Kipling." The influence of Kipling is important, as it was partly through his influence on the Banjo's wartime ballads that we developed the image of the Australian soldier that would become central to the Anzac legend. That Anzac legend is now a pillar of our cultural memory. The following stanza from the poem, The Revile, is illustrative of this imperial influence. When we hear our brethren call, sound a clear revile. When we answer one and all, answer that the world may see. Of the English stock are we, at their side we still will be. Sound a bold. Am I pronouncing this wrong? Reveille?
I'm actually not sure, mate. I probably is meant to rhyme with B and we. I believe it's originally a French word, so definitely those bloody Frenchies tripping us up.
Yeah,
what it is. I know what it is. I haven't actually heard it pronounced. It's like a military call on the horn or the trumpet, right, to kind of like wake people up and get people going.
Yeah, well,
it's probably reveille or something like that, or reveille.
Yeah. The way I was saying it was the Australian pronunciation, and therefore the correct pronunciation. All right, shall I continue?
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, this leads into the next key event on the national calendar, which is the 10th of March, Commonwealth Day, or as I still like to think of it, Empire Day. There was a time when Empire Day was the biggest national celebration on the Australian calendar. While Australia Day was a much more minor affair, as we can see from Paterson's writing, even the strongly nativist identity of the bush poets was still firmly placed in a context of empire. I have argued in the past that, although nativism must come first, it is very important to strengthen the civilizational bloc that is the Anglosphere. The celebration of Banjo Night in February, followed by Empire Day in March, sets a pattern that I believe is very important for nationalists to follow. We must first prioritise our uniquely Australian culture and history, which is the core of our identity, but then turn to the broader and internationally shared circle of British imperial culture, which also undeniably shapes our national expression. We are not merely British people in Australia, but we should be grateful to that parent nation that we took so much from. This is the reason enough to celebrate Empire Day. But it will also provide us with an opportunity to build our international ties with our closest kin in related nationalist movements. I can see a time when this will once again be a proud celebration across the entire Anglosphere. Of course, we should not look past all the mistakes of the British Empire or even desire to reconstruct it in its inherently multiracial character. After all, it was the British Empire that several times prevented the implementation of the immigration restriction policies in this country. Nevertheless, we should look to the old Commonwealth of white British colonies as the image of the core of the Anglosphere. We also shouldn't neglect Ireland, though it has, in many ways and for good reasons, fallen out of the common fold. Many Australian nationalists would do well to spend a little more time studying the history of the British Isles, and especially pivotal events such as the British Civil Wars, and a little less time on the continent with our German friends. We have been bequeathed one of the finest political legacies in the world, and with some tweaking, the British system of government can be refined into that great unity of organic nationalist feeling, with rigorous Platonist reason that Hegel proposed as the next stage of the advancement of Western politics. But to make this a real possibility, we must remember who we are. We must defend the monuments that embody our memory in the spaces of our land. We must strengthen our cultural memory and shape the flow of time in the year after nationalist patterns. By engaging with key dates on the national calendar like Australia Day or Anzac Day, Banjo Night or Empire Day, people tap into and absorb cultural memory. The nationalist movement must act as the cultural vanguard for the Australian populist right, because there is no one else who can do it. Remember who you are. So that was the end of Elias's article.
Yeah, a lot in there. We talked a bit about Empire before. Yeah, I mean, I haven't read as much Hegel probably as he has, but the meme understanding of it, I think, is the organic stuff kind of comes from ancient Greece and the city-states, I believe, where like obviously that was a very organic, natural community, a small community which can do these things like direct democracy and all citizens being involved in the state and having that sense of unified identity and culture, and then as you get these imperial projects like Rome and so on, you get these larger sort of rationalist, bureaucratic entities. And I think the kind of synthesis or whatever is meant to be coming back to like a nationalist system where the king represents the nation, but you also have developed that bureaucratic element into kind of like a philosopher king, a court of philosopher kings for the king who represents the nation, something like that. But that's kind of the Spurgy side that's always in an Elias article. Look, the empire stuff, I do think the Anglosphere identity is important, and a lot is made of Australia turning, I suppose, from the British Empire towards the US in World War II. And all of that, but it's kind of a bit overplayed, because looking at events from after World War II, like the Suez Crisis, for instance, I'm not sure how familiar you are with it, but look, the British Empire...
Not at all. Not
yeah,
at all,
right.
So.
Well, the British Empire and the French were kind of scheming to maintain control of the Suez Canal, which is in Egypt, right? The Egyptians wanted to take control of it, and there was all this sort of Cold War politics around it as well. But what ended up happening is the British basically went in to seize it, and they had their fleet there to support their soldiers, and the Yanks basically sent a fleet in there and told them, no, you're not doing this. It's not in our interest, bugger off. And basically, had the British gone on, the Americans probably would have fired on them, and there would have been a conflict there. So much for any special relationship between the British and the Americans. That's something that Peter Hitchens has always gone to some lengths to point out. But while the Americans were very much against it, our own Menzies was the PM at the time. And he went totally in support of the English. Like, he even pretty much was going to send the president an extremely hostile letter, but the foreign minister surreptitiously popped that in the bin, which did prevent a diplomatic incident from happening there. But no, the Australians, we were definitely totally behind the British still there as compared to the Americans. So.
That's interesting. I haven't heard about this before, but I'm not surprised. Just Monroe Doctrine across the entire universe. Yeah.
Yeah. Like we'll have to do some reading around it and do a proper show on it at some point. But yeah, that's an interesting period because, well, I suppose that is a very important period that we do need to look at, because this is all happening at the time of decolonization, and that's part of what the US was pushing as well. They were pushing that decolonization agenda. They basically robbed all the gold out of the out of the British Treasury because they were insisting on these gold repayments during World War II and stuff. So yeah, we'll get into it another time. But
yeah,
what do you reckon? The Anglosphere identity, is it important? Do we need to network with people overseas, or?
I would say yes. Not like primary importance, but as like a secondary thing. Yeah, we want to be maintaining good relations with our international colleagues, our fellow nativists from different shores. And this, in a funny way, it kind of circles back to what we were saying at the start about the Barossa German, and this looking back and being in touch with your roots, with your ancestors. And I think that's always a good thing. If somebody was to not want to do that, if they were like, oh no, where I'm from sucks and my ancestors are the worst, I would be incredibly suspect on that person. That's my thoughts on the Elias article.
Yeah, I think an interesting one we haven't said anything much about yet is the point about Empire Day being kind of like a bigger holiday. Even I think this includes at the start of the 20th century, because you'll have lefties come out and talk about, Australia Day wasn't really a holiday and it's only become a unified thing in the 90s or whenever, that we all celebrated on January the 26th in commemoration of the First Fleet.
Yeah.
But
what are you proposing a return to tradition and we start celebrating Empire Day?
I point out that it was the Australian Natives Association that was instrumental in pushing the campaign for Australia Day to even be an event. And originally it was actually called ANA Day. So it was our association day pretty much.
I still feel like it is.
Yeah. Well, we are the true culture bearers of the Australian nation, aren't we?
Yeah, the cultural vanguard, as Elias called it.
Correct. But as you said, I think, it's still important to remember the importance of our British heritage and all the things that we took away from it, including the English language that we're reading all this poetry in, and no doubt much of it contains allusions to the older English poets. So with that, shall we continue on with some of the poetry?
Yes, let's.
All right, what on earth do we have next? Oh, it's some Lawson. All right, so here's one from the Bulletin debate, which was a sort of friendly rivalry / PR move by Lawson and Paterson to have this little back and forth about the city versus the bush in Australian identity. So starting off, we have Henry Lawson's Up the Country. I am back from up the country, very sorry that I went, seeking for the southern poet's land whereon to pitch my tent. I have lost a lot of idols which were broken on the track, burnt a lot of fancy verses, and I'm glad that I am back. Further out may be the pleasant scenes of which our poets boast, but I think the country is rather more inviting round the coast. Anyway, I'll stay at present at a boarding house in town, drinking beer and lemon squashes, taking baths and cooling down. Sunny plains, great Scott, those burning wastes of barren soil and sand with their everlasting fences stretching out across the land, desolation where the crow is, desert where the eagle flies, paddocks where the loony bullock starts and stares with reddened eyes, where, in clouds of dust enveloped, roasted bullock drivers creep slowly past the sun-dried shepherd dragging behind his crawling sheep. Stunted peak of granite gleaming, glaring like a molten mass, turned from some infernal furnace on a plain devoid of grass. Miles and miles of thirsty gutters, strings of muddy hot water holes in the place of shining rivers, walled by cliffs and forest bowls. Barren ridges, gullies, ridges, where the ever-maddening flies, fiercer than the plagues of Egypt, swarm about your blighted eyes. Bush, where there is no horizon, where the buried bushman sees nothing, nothing but the sameness of the ragged, stunted trees. Lonely hut where drought's eternal suffocating atmosphere, where the God-forgotten hatter dreams of city life and beer. Treacherous tracks that trap the stranger, endless roads that gleam and glare, dark and evil-looking gullies hiding secrets here and there, dull, dumb flats and stony rises where the toiling bullocks break, and the sinister goanna and the lizard and the snake. A land of day and night, no morning freshness and no afternoon, when the great white sun in rising bringeth summer heat in June. Dismal country for the exile when the shades begin to fall, from the sad heart-breaking sunset to the new chum worst of all. Dreary land in rainy weather, with the endless clouds that drift o'er the bushman like a blanket that the Lord will never lift. Dismal land when it is raining, growl of floods, and oh, the whoosh of the rain and the wind together on the dark bed of the bush. Ghastly fires in lonely humpies where the granite rocks are piled in the rain-swept wildernesses that are the wildest of the wild. Land where gaunt and haggard women live alone and work like men, till their husbands, gone a-droving, will return to them again. Homes of men, if home had ever such a God-forgotten place, where the wild selector's children fly before a stranger's face. Home of tragedy applauded by the dingo's dismal yell, heaven of the shanty keeper, fitting fiend for such a hell. And the wallaroos and wombats, and of course the curlew's call, and the lone sundowner tramping ever onward through it all. I am back from up the country where I went, seeking for the southern poet's land whereon to pitch my tent. I have shattered many idols out along the dusty track, burnt a lot of fancy verses, and I'm glad that I am back. I believe the southern poet's dream will not be realised till the plains are irrigated and the land is humanised. I intend to stay at present, as I said before, in town, drinking beer and lemon squashes, taking baths and cooling down. There we go. That was the poem Up the Country by Henry Lawson. What did you think, Trent?
Well, there was bits of it where I felt like Lawson was just being a big wet blanket, but then there was also some other moments where I was feeling it when he's talking about the baking sun and the flies around your face.
Yeah.
I've been there. I've had moments like that. So I definitely the lemon squashes and a cool bath sounded all right too.
Yeah, it's a big sort of theme in Lawson's work. He's much less romantic about the country. I mean, he did have a love for the bush. He famously, his best mate, fellow poet, I've forgotten his name at the moment, I think it was Jim Gordon. That time that he had with Jim and hanging out with him was out back of Burke. So he did like the bush, but he was, I think, very realistic about the bush. And for those who don't know, Lawson's not just a poet, but he is also a very famous, for Australia, or a very influential short story and sketch writer. And there are really, it's a very sort of meta poem in that it's commenting on the tradition of Australian poetry and particularly Australian bush poetry. But there are also some callbacks to some of his own stories where he's talking about gaunt and haggard women live alone and work like men. Probably his most famous story is The Drover's Wife, which is about, of course, a lady who's left alone with her children while her husband's, who is a former squatter who's been ruined by drought, which is, again, the harshness of the outback, ruined by the droughts and all that, has had to go back to droving. And she's sort of left alone in isolation, basically in the middle of nowhere. I think 19 miles to the nearest sign of civilization, which is a shanty on the road. And the whole story revolves around a snake that's the black snake that's come onto the property and now hiding under the floorboards of her house. And she's got her children there. And the whole story is her kind of waiting for this. She's got all the children in the outback kitchen, which is like a separate structure with an earth floor. And basically, it's kind of a Gothic story. So we probably won't talk about it too much today, but there's a whole big genre of Australian Gothic, because Gothic literature really rose to prominence at the same time that Australia was being settled, and people were going around and, settling the country and forming all these new places. And so they were reading this Gothic literature from England at the same time, and that was part of what was shaping their mentality and their sort of vocabulary for expressing, their experiences. And Lawson himself, he was raised. His mother was the poet, or the poetically minded person. His father was a worker, a guy who worked very hard with his hands, which would be, I guess, influential on some of Lawson's characters as well. But his mother would read Edgar Allan Poe to him, which is the American writer of the Gothic genre. Stories like The Telltale Heart and things like that. And it's there's a lot of Gothic elements in his work, and I suppose that's some of the negativity that we get in things like this. The sort of the maddening. Gothic is very about the psychological experiences that you have in reaction to different things. And for Lawson, a big theme is the isolation and just the barrenness and hostility of the bush, where you get, bush where there is no horizon, where the buried bushman sees nothing but the sameness of the ragged, stunted trees. Yeah, that sort of stuff. But yeah, like a bit more positive again in the last stanza, where he says, "I believe the southern poet's dream will not be realized till the plains are irrigated and the land is humanized." So it's not the case that Australia is just perpetually going to be hostile to the European settler, but I guess we'll put it this way: a native generation will arise that will transform the bush into this new paradise. And I think, that has been realised to a large extent. Obviously, Lawson's right; the coasts are the most hospitable places for settlement, but Australia clearly has, become a paradise among nations. Hence, the desire for so many to come here.
Yes. All right. Are we gonna hear Banjo Paterson's response?
Yeah, sure. Here we go then. So you're back from up the country, Mr. Lawson, where you went, and you're cursing all the business in a bit of discontent. Well, we grieve to disappoint you, and it makes us sad to hear that it wasn't cool and shady, and there wasn't plenty beer. And the loony bullock snorted when you first came into view. Well, it's not so often that he sees a swell like you. And the roads were hot and dusty, and the plains were burnt and brown, and no doubt you're better suited drinking lemon squash in town. Yet perchance, if you should journey down the track you went, in a month or two at furthest, you would wonder what it meant. Where the sun-baked earth was gasping like a creature in its pain, you would find the grasses waving like a field of summer grain. And the miles of thirsty gutters, blocked with sand and choked with mud, you would find the mighty rivers with a turbid sweeping flood. For the rain and drought and sunshine make no changes in the street, in the sullen line of buildings and the ceaseless tramp of feet. But the bush has moods and changes as the seasons rise and fall, and the men who know the bushland, they are loyal through it all. But you found the bush was dismal and a land of no delight. Did you chance to hear a chorus in the shearers' huts at night? Did they rise up William Riley by the campfire's cheery blaze? Did they rise him as we rose him in the good old droving days? And the women of the homesteads and the men you chanced to meet, were their faces sour and saddened like the faces in the street? And the shy selected children, were they better now or worse than the little city urchins who would greet you with a curse? Is not such a life much better than the squalid street and square, where the fallen women flaunted in the fierce electric glare, where the sempstress plies her sewing till her eyes are sore and red, in a filthy dirty attic, toiling on for daily bread? Did you hear trams and buses, and the war whoop of the push? Did the magpies rouse your slumbers with their carols sweet and strange? Did you hear the silver chiming of the bellbirds on the range? But perchance the wild bird's music by your senses was despised, for you say you'll stay in townships till the bush is civilized. Would you make it a tea garden, and on Sundays have a band where the blokes might take their donors, with a public close at hand? You had better stick to Sydney and make merry with the push, for the bush will never suit you, and you'll never suit the bush. What did you think of that one, mate?
Fantastic. I really enjoyed that. I'd have to say I sympathise more with Paterson's view, the pro-Bush poem. In fairness, though, he had a lot to work off. Like Lawson had given him a sort of good structure to build upon. Did you have a winner or a favoured position?
Yeah, look, to be honest, I have to say I'm probably a little more sympathetic to Lawson for a couple of reasons. I just think his writing, at least in this poem, is a little more profound, and also I think a little more artistic. Like, I like Paterson, but he's like a very light read as well, like a sort of, a happy balladist style, right, which is very musical and just flows along nicely. But Lawson, I kind of like the breaks in it, and all those exclamation marks, which I don't know if those came through in my reading of the poem. Not necessarily the greatest reciter of poetry, but it's definitely I definitely have to go with Lawson. And I do agree. I do agree with Paterson on some points. Yeah, the cities can be absolute cesspits of degeneracy. He is right. You do have the women plying their trades in the fierce electric glare. The fallen women flaunted in the fierce electric glare. That's a great line. Or the little city urchins who greet you with a curse. I guess they had eshays back then as well. But I think with Lawson as well, like, the city is kind of where the power and the civilization kind of by nature has to be. Like, that is the nature of a city, is to sort of centralize power and the ability to create great things that just aren't logistically possible out in the bush. And there are nice aspects to Paterson's more romantic vision, but I think I'm more with Lawson despite the negativity. And he's by no means the most negative of the poets and short story writers, because there's also Barcroft Boak, most famous for the poem Where the Dead Men Lie, which is a fantastic poem. I didn't actually add it to the list on for today's podcast, but definitely worth people going and checking out Barcroft Boak's Where the Dead Men Lie. Very interesting stuff happens in that poem with rhythm, particularly. But that's it's more explicitly Gothic than the Lawson stuff we've looked at today, in talking about the bush as this haunted place, basically, where the exploitation of workers by the rich, by the new rich, is resulted in them dying, whether they're youngsters or greybeards, and the rich are just complacently sitting in their city clubs, looking at the wealth that they have gained. So that is Barcroft Boak, who also hung himself with his stock whip. So that's a bit more negative. And for the short story writers, Barbara Bainton is a lot more negative than Lawson. She takes like Lawson's work, like the drover's wife, and basically creates a version where it's not a snake that's the threat. It's a swag man who is gonna like rape the woman and kill her. So no happy endings in Bainton as compared to Lawson, where the snake gets crushed by the drover's wife. So that's a little taster or a couple of suggestions if you're interested in and doing a little more reading of Australian poetry and literature, there are some options for you to go look at. Anything more you wanted to say about either of these poems, Trent?
Yeah, actually, when I was reading the Lawson one, it's about the bush, but the image that it conjured for me was on just this weekend gone. I had been out to Aurora, which is a new build estate on the Sunshine Coast, and it's one of those like less than 300 square meter blocks, rabbit warren streets. Every house looks the same, and I went in there and I was just struck by like the heat, and there's no horizon. All you can see is just white roofs into the distance. And as I was reading that Lawson poem, I was thinking, well, does this really even apply this city versus bush distinction? Because there's only a pretty small portion of people that live in the city proper or in the bush proper. Most Australians live in the suburbs, and there's kind of the old version of the suburbs, the Australian dream, quarter acre, 2 cars and a pool. And then we have this new version of the suburbs, which is like a Smurf village on a reclaimed swamp. and I think I thought it was, that's what came to mind when I was thinking about this like, is the bush or the outback good, or is the city good? And we in modern Australia, we kind of live in this in between space where, like maybe you have a little bit of a backyard and a bit of space and you see a bit of nature, but you're not really in the bush, but you're also not really in the city either. I just wanted to share my thoughts on that.
Yeah, you're right. This is definitely very much pre-suburbia poetry, but I agree with everything that you said there. Definitely, and there are other good poets who talk about suburbia. What's his name? I actually read one of his poems in one of the shows. Oh, no, I can't remember. It'll come back to me. Roman Catholic poets, anti-Vietnam War poetry and stuff. Oh, yeah. Never mind. It'll either come to me or it won't. And I'm sure our loyal listeners have listened to all the shows and know exactly who I'm talking about anyway. All right. Next on the list was Australia Day discussion. We kind of talked about it already. I guess we were just going to say a few things about what happened. Obviously, we had the different branch events. So is there anything much you want to share about what happened in Queensland, Trent?
We, as a branch, we all attended. There was an event that a guy called Dusty put on in Brisbane, and it's just a sort of generally, I guess, conservative or right wing leaning people get together. We had a barbecue in the park and did some esky races and a couple of other fun things. It was a really enjoyable day. All the boys, all our families and kids and everything there. And then afterwards we went back to someone's house and had a bit of an after party. But that was it for our Australia Day events.
Yeah, our one was interesting. Like, we went out and had a barbecue. It was pretty interesting weather on the day because it was kind of a bit stormy in the morning, and then it transformed from thunderstorm to 40-degree summer heat. So it was a Lawson Australia Day and not a Paterson Australia Day. But no, it was a beautiful day. Obviously, we had the sausages there, nice barbecue, and a couple of the more adventurous boys went out and played some cricket in the 40-degree heat, which was not my cup of tea. I guess I am siding with Empire Day and sitting back in the shade with a cup of tea there. But yeah, no, it was good. It was beautiful. And for those who are on X, they can see some photos of those branch events from the 3 main branches. And hopefully this year we'll see a few more branches popping up, especially if people will get in contact with us. And I know there are a couple in the works. So if you're in an area without a branch, still contact us. We will look at your application. We'll talk to you. If you don't want to set it up yourself, there might be someone in the area who is thinking of setting up a branch anyway, and you can just hop on as a regular member or in a supporting role. But there's the pitch. Shall we move on and do maybe one more poem and finish off there?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, here's probably a touch more controversial one, but Jindi Warabaks were mentioned in the Elias article. So
Yes.
Here is one of them, Ian Muddy, and the poem is Australia Day 1942, on the Australia Day theme that we just had. So Australia Day 1942. If ever it were time for the dead to ride, then surely that time is now. From Lewin's cliffs to the roar of Sydney side, from Wyndham to the How, call up your ghosts, Australia, call up your many dead, your Kelly and your Lawler and the shirted men they led. Call up your Brave, your Stewart, your Wentworth, your Bennelong, your men who dared Hashemi with its bitter slavish wrong. Call up your Quietened singers from the silence of the grave, who sang your latent spirit to the complaining wave. Call up your myths and your legends, your men of song and tale, men from the snowy, the centre, and lakes where the bunyips wail. Your seekers, your finders, your fighters, your men who with Clancy ride, Lawson's men from the western creeks and 1,000 more beside. Call up your ghosts, Australia, and set them riding far to rouse the sleeping nation to its seven-pointed star. Call up your dead Australians and bid them ride with you to set your rivers brimming with Eureka's flood anew. Call up your hosts, Australia, to strive with you amain, to fight, to sing, to honour your flag of stars again. Then, when the day is over, whether to shout or to weep, keep ever your dead alive in you, oh, never let them sleep. For the nation that forgets its dead, that lets its heroes lie dust deep in its mind forever, is surely ripe to die. And only those who go on in glory their story to make, whoever keep their dead alive, their songs and their heroes awake. Now is the time for the nation's urgent dead to ride, so set them riding here and now. From the Lewins cliffs to the roar of Sydney side, from Wyndham to the How. That was Australia Day 1942 by Ian Muddy, one of the most prominent of the Jindi Warabaks. And for those who don't know, are you familiar with the Jindi Warabaks at all, Trent?
I've read the Wikipedia article.
Okay, so you're roughly in the same position as me. I've read a few of Ian Muddy's works, but I haven't read too much about them as a group. I'm familiar with only a couple of examples of their work. There's a musical piece as well, a ballet called Corroboree, which I can't remember the composer of, but that's a Stravinsky-esque type piece, very discordant. Oh, you've seen it, have you?
I haven't seen it. I've seen a picture of the costumes. Looks interesting.
Yes. So from the things, some of the references in here, the keen listener may have picked up a mention of Bennelong, of bunyips. So yes, the Jindis were seeking to incorporate sort of elements of existing, I guess, Aboriginal culture or Aboriginal history, or kind of seeking to include that element of Australia's history within the culture of the nation, consciously standing against this sort of cultural cringe desire to sort of measure up to British standards or to go along with British tropes and this perpetual sort of thing in the Australian psyche where we see ourselves as somehow like a lesser Britain, and if only we could measure up to the mother country. But no, the Jindis were very much we need to be proud in our land, in our own earth. And there's a great Muddy poem called Earth that talks about this earth, our earth, which is another powerful one. But again, not on the list. Go look it up if you're interested in some of the poetry we've been talking about. Yeah, but do you know who Bennelong is?
No,
This
don't.
is now a history quiz, and
that went over my head.
Yeah, so Bennelong was it was kind of, I can't remember if he was like a tribal chief, but he was definitely a very influential guy among the New South Wales tribes during the time of the First Fleet and settlement, when Arthur Phillip came in as governor and he was setting up the colony. And Bennelong was a guy who got basically kidnapped, and because they were like they did they weren't doing the settlers weren't doing it as like an overtly hostile thing, but they wanted to build relations, and the tribes were kind of just like quarantining Sydney Cove and not trying to interact with the people like the British too much. So Arthur Phillip, whose orders were to treat the natives well, was trying to like set up some sort of diplomatic relations. And Bennelong was one of the guys who got picked up and came and was made to live among the colony. And he ended up getting along with the people okay-ish, but like then there's a whole like song and dance to it. I think we talked about it back in the First Fleet, early settlement stuff in the podcast I did with Grant. So if the listener's really interested, they can go back and hear a more accurate portrayal of it all back then when it was a bit fresher in my mind. But yeah, so he was an Aboriginal bloke. He ended up even going back to England and meeting the king.
Oh yeah, this is sounding familiar now.
Yeah, he's like the one of the two Aboriginals you'll learn about in history.
Yeah.
Back in high school, sort of thing, right? Like Bennelong and Pemulwuy or whatever.
Yeah, the image, there's like a portrait in profile of him, like in a suit with a cravat or something. That's just flashed into my head. Yeah, I know who he is now.
Yeah, but obviously, like controversial in the poetry for like a nationalist movement and consciously nationalist guys to be including Bennelong among Kelly, Lawler, Stewart, and Wentworth, and then you've got Bennelong, right? So, the Jindies were derided a bit by the by other guys who were like, okay, so we have to express our nationality using, the words and figures of this like most primitive people on the entire planet and that sort of rhetoric. I'm somewhat sympathetic to them. Like, I'm not one of these guys who's really hostile to Aboriginals or whatever. Obviously, it's undeniable that they've been heavily degraded, I guess, as a people. And to some extent, obviously, they already lived in a way that is not for us, to put it mildly. If you look at some of the things that they did, their practices around maintaining the size of the population when it came to children and things like that, and things that they did for their initiation rites. Penile subincision to name one for the connoisseurs of Aboriginal culture.
If you're a real Jindi, you'll do that.
Yeah, I definitely will not go that far. But yeah, I don't think that Aboriginals need to be all deported or anything like that either. So I think there has to be a kind of middle ground where they can go and do their own thing in their own spaces and maybe have some sort of development of their culture along whatever lines they like. And obviously they can't go back to pristine conditions of whatever they were before we arrived, but we came and we conquered. And that's how history goes. And we won't be giving modern Australia back, that's for sure. We are natives now. So,
yes.
But I do think that, around the Aboriginal issues, like a lot of it is driven by these special interest groups and, the whole Aboriginal grievance industry and these people who aren't even Aboriginals, right?
Many such cases.
We know you have these figures like the Lieblers and so on, and you'll hear the progressive Aboriginals complain about it as well if you ever go and listen to any stuff from the other side. But they also complain about this. Not that they are any allies of ours, that's for sure. But there are, I think, some Aboriginals out there who we can make a reasonable deal with, and we should acknowledge that this is part of our history. So,
yes.
What's your take on it? Because I'm willing to hear the complete opposite from my take. But
no, I'm with you. I don't think there's any path forward where like we're gonna deport them all to India or something, which is something you might read online somewhere. I don't think that that's going to happen, but also this sort of always was, always will be industrial complex is not, it's not suitable either. Like there's no way forward. It's not good for anybody involved. So there needs to be a sort of middle path charted towards a positive future.
Yeah. So that's obviously one thing that we can take out of this poem, because again, we are talking about a poem here, so we may as well have a look at it. But
yes,
it almost reminded me back to the first one we read, the Song of Federation, not because of its structure or style. It's obviously a completely different style of poem to the banjo's sort of ballad style. But that theme of the nation's dead, making the nation, and the need to turn back and remember those figures, and the theme of cultural memory that we had in the
in that Elias article.
In the Elias article. And I didn't really plan this out too heavily, so it's kind of nice that it's bookended it nicely. But this idea: call up your ghosts, Australia, call up your many dead, your Kelly and your Lawler and the shirted men they led. Yeah, and a bit further on, call up your myths and legends, your men of song and tale. There's one particular. You've got the references back to the other poetry. Your men who with Clancy ride, Clancy of the Overflow, famous character invented by Banjo Paterson. And you've got the poem Clancy of the Overflow, but he appears in other poems as well. So Clancy appears in a bunch of Banjo Paterson poems. But then, so the next line of this poem, we've got, Lawson's men from the Western Creek. So he references, obviously, back to the tradition of poetry that's important to remember and call up as well, which we are doing consciously with Banjo Day. I just like the last part of this. I kind of just want to read it again because it's so great. Call up your hosts, Australia, to strive with your main, to fight, to sing, to honour your flag of stars again. Then when the day is over, whether to shout or to weep, keep ever your dead alive in you, or never let them sleep. For the nation that forgets its dead, that lets its heroes lie dust deep in its mind forever, is surely ripe to die. And only those go on in glory their story to make, whoever keep their dead alive, their songs and their heroes awake. Now is the time for the nation's urgent dead to ride, so set them riding here and now. The Ewan's cliffs, the roar of Sydney's side, from Wyndham to the Howe. I just think that's great, but that's my taste.
The nation that forgets its dead is surely ripe to die. For me, the energy of that, it really echoes the ending of that Elias article. Remember who you are.
Yeah.
So that's what it says to me.
Yeah. Is there anything more to be said at this point? I think this is a good time to let the podcast end with that message. Remember who you are. Remember who you are. Take your time to go and call up our heroes, call up our poets, and keep the memory of the dead alive. All right. So let us know in the comments what topics you'd like to hear about from us, or if there's a particular topic relating to Australia or the ANA that you'd like us to do a show on. As always, I'd encourage all our supporters in the audience to make sure you like and subscribe and share our content far and wide. We'd love to share our show with as many good Aussies as possible. Lastly, if you want to reach out, you can find us at ausnatives.org. That's AUSNATIVES.org. Signing off.
There's a track winding back to an old-fashioned shack along the road to Gundagai, where the blue gums are growing and the Murrumbidgee is flowing beneath that sunny sky, where my daddy and mother are waiting for me, and the pals of my childhood once more I will see. Then no more will I roam when I'm heading right for home along the road to Gundagai.
Hello, old-timer. How's things? They're pretty crook. Things must be pretty crook round these parts, mate. What with no rain for your stock and them all dying, you must be having a pretty crook trot. but you ain't got it all on your own. Blimey, no. The other day I asked a bloke if he had any old clothes he didn't want. Sprucely took a look at me and said, ain't them you got on old enough? Yes, things is pretty crook, all right. I knocked on a bloke's door the other day, and when the missus comes out, I gets down on me hands and knees and started eating the grass. I said, Missus, I'm not hungry, I'll eat grass. She said, you poor man, go round the back, it's much longer. Yes, things is crook, all right. Well, suppose I'd better be jogging along. Hooray, mate, hooray. I'll see you again.